In June 1940, northern France was collapsing. German armored divisions were advancing faster than any military force in history. Every hour, new towns fell. Every day, new roads opened under the tracks of tanks painted with the Black Cross. South of Cambrai, the 7th Panzer Division under General Erwin Rommel pushed toward the Somme. Their orders were simple: crush the remaining French resistance and reach the coast. Speed was everything. Precision, discipline, and firepower had already brought France to its knees. To the Germans, one more farm, one more field meant nothing. But one particular field refused to behave as expected. The morning of June 6th was overcast, the ground still wet from days of rain. German reconnaissance reported the area clear, soft but stable. No enemy units, no mines, no obstacles. At 0740, the first column of Panzer III tanks entered the northern edge of the Laurent farmland. It was supposed to be a routine crossing, 2 minutes at most. Instead, it became a disaster. The lead tank had covered barely 50 meters when the ground beneath it cracked open. The front tread sank, twisted, and jammed. The second tank tried to steer left, only to feel its right track collapse under the same invisible pressure. By 0743, 3 tanks were immobilized. By 0747, the entire spearhead had stopped. Engines roared at full throttle, spewing exhaust and mud, but none could move. From a distance, the scene looked impossible, as if the earth itself had swallowed steel. German engineers later described the soil as irregularly layered, noting that the top crust gave the appearance of stability, while the substructure had disintegrated under pressure. They blamed drainage failure and poor French farming methods. They were wrong. The field had been deliberately shaped that way. Beneath what looked like an ordinary layer of clay and wheat stubble lay a network of hollowed channels, rows of man-made cavities designed to collapse under weight greater than 10 tons. They weren't dug by engineers or soldiers. They were built by a farmer, Émile Laurent, a man with no formal military background, no formal training, and no intention of ever fighting in a war. The system had been created 2 years earlier as part of an agricultural experiment. It was never meant to trap tanks. It was designed to trap water. Yet on that morning, in a forgotten corner of France, that same design turned one patch of farmland into a natural anti-tank weapon. 6 German vehicles were disabled within minutes. The rest of the column was forced to reroute, costing the division almost 5 hours of maneuvering. In the chaos, 2 supply trucks overturned, and 1 Panzer burned out completely after its fuel line ruptured during extraction. German records from the day mention the event only once, labeling it as anomaly, soft terrain. No one in command suspected the truth. No one imagined that the so-called soft terrain had been engineered not by the French army, but by a farmer working alone with a plow, a shovel, and an idea no one took seriously. In early May 1940, France still believed its defenses were impenetrable. The Maginot Line, a chain of concrete fortresses stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg, was considered one of the strongest military barriers ever built. Behind it stood the confidence of a nation that had defeated Germany in 1918. But while French generals prepared for another slow, grinding war, Germany planned something entirely different. The new strategy was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It relied on speed, coordination, and shock. Instead of attacking the Maginot Line directly, German forces struck through the Ardennes, a region the French had dismissed as impossible for tanks. On May 10th, the invasion began. Within 5 days, 3 Panzer Corps had crossed the Meuse River. By May 20th, they reached the English Channel, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and encircling almost 500,000 Allied troops. It was the fastest large-scale advance in modern history. For the French command, chaos replaced strategy. Communications broke down. Orders issued at dawn were obsolete by noon. Entire units vanished, either destroyed or retreating without direction. Civilians fled south, clogging the roads with carts, bicycles, and livestock, a moving ocean of panic. German divisions used them as cover, driving their tanks through the same roads at full speed, horns blaring, clearing the path with machine gun bursts. It wasn't just a military assault, it was psychological warfare. Every village that resisted was flattened by artillery within minutes. The rest surrendered without a fight. By early June, the German army had taken more territory in 4 weeks than it had in 4 years of the previous war. The French Air Force was shattered. The British were evacuating from Dunkirk. Paris itself stood undefended. But victory had created its own kind of blindness. German intelligence believed that organized resistance no longer existed north of the Somme. Reports described the French countryside as secured, ideal for armored transport. Tank divisions were ordered to move quickly, ignoring side roads and farm paths. It was this assumption that nothing could slow them down that led to the mistake near Cambrai. The 7th Panzer Division, known later as the Ghost Division, advanced so fast that even German headquarters lost track of its position for 2 full days. They drove through abandoned villages, over flooded fields, and across improvised bridges built from farm planks and wagons. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and exhaustion slowed them only briefly. Then came the rain. For 3 days, northern France was soaked. What had been solid terrain turned to mud. But the orders remained the same: keep moving. The division was instructed to reach Arras and cut off any remaining French columns. Engineers warned that heavy armor shouldn't cross the wet lowlands near Cambrai. Their warnings were ignored. At 7:30 on June 6th, the first tanks entered the farmland that maps listed simply as Sector C-12. There were no fortifications, no signs of enemy presence, just open countryside. To the Germans, it looked like another easy crossing. They couldn't have known that under the soil lay something not built by soldiers, but by a farmer, and that it would cost them hours, equipment, and men in a campaign measured by minutes. Émile Laurent was not a soldier. He was a 38-year-old farmer who lived with his wife and daughter on the outskirts of Cambrai, a region known for its heavy clay soil and endless flat fields. His family had worked that same land for 3 generations. They were ordinary people, shaped by routine, weather, and the slow rhythm of harvests. To most of his neighbors, Émile was strange. He repaired his own machinery, collected scrap metal from old farm equipment, and spent long nights in the barn welding improvised tools together. He wasn't an engineer, but he had an engineer's curiosity, a need to understand how things worked and why they failed. He spoke little, worked constantly, and rarely went into town except for supplies. By 1937, he had become obsessed with one question every farmer in northern France struggled with: how to control water. In spring, the ground flooded. In summer, it cracked like stone. Traditional drainage systems were expensive and inefficient, so Émile began experimenting. He noticed that when rainwater pooled in certain sections of his field, the soil beneath became hollow after the water drained. The ground appeared solid, but was actually layered with empty pockets of air. When a wagon rolled over those spots, the top layer collapsed instantly, swallowing the wheels before settling again. Most farmers saw this as a nuisance. Émile saw a pattern. Over the next 2 years, he designed what he called an underground channel system. Using a modified plow and wooden frames, he carved narrow trenches about 1/2 meter deep,
filled them with gravel and clay, and covered them so the surface looked untouched. He arranged these channels in cross patterns that followed the natural flow of water. The design allowed the soil to drain faster after heavy rain, storing moisture below the surface and releasing it slowly during dry periods. In short, it was a primitive form of subsurface irrigation, decades ahead of its time. The villagers laughed at him. They called his invention the fool's furrows. The local agricultural inspector dismissed it as pointless labor. But Émile didn't stop. He tested different depths and patterns, kept notes on how quickly the channels collapsed, and measured how much pressure the surface could hold before breaking. By late 1939, as the war in Europe grew closer, Émile had expanded his experiment to nearly 5 acres of land. When German broadcasts filled the radio, he ignored them. He didn't believe the war would reach his farm. But as news spread of Poland's fall, and then Denmark's, Émile began to wonder how the land he knew so well might behave under something heavier than wagons, like a tank. He started making calculations in his notebook. A fully loaded Panzer III weighed around 22 tons and distributed its weight across 2 tracks, each less than half a meter wide. That meant more than 20,000 kilograms of pressure per square meter, enough to crush a weak sublayer instantly. Émile realized that the same hollow channels that stored water could also give way under that pressure, collapsing the soil from beneath. What he had built to conserve rain could, in theory, trap steel. It was never his intention to make a weapon. He simply understood the land better than most. But as the months passed and the thunder of artillery drew closer, his quiet experiment began to look like something else, a defense, one that required no soldiers, no explosives, and no command from above, just earth, gravity, and patience.
By the winter of 1939, France was at war. But on the northern frontier, life still moved slowly. The government called it la drogue de guerre, the phony war. Newspapers printed headlines of tension, but no real battles. For Émile Laurent, the world outside his village felt distant. His concern remained the same as always, the ground beneath his feet. He kept adjusting his underground channels, refining the system. What had begun as an irrigation method was now turning into something else, a study of how much pressure the earth could take before it failed. He recorded everything in a notebook: the depth of each trench, the mix of gravel and clay, the distance between the supports. He even measured the force required to break the surface crust using old iron weights and wagon wheels. When soldiers began passing through the countryside, Émile offered to help repair their trucks. He wasn't political. He didn't speak of patriotism or hate. But what he saw disturbed him. Vehicles getting stuck, engines overheating, officers confused about where to move next. The French army looked tired before the real fight had even begun. By February 1940, Émile made a decision. He expanded his underground network beyond irrigation use. He selected one field, the largest and flattest on his property, about 4 hectares wide, and redesigned it completely. The top layer remained untouched, but underneath he created a grid of hollow intersections, spaced every few meters. Each cavity was packed with a layer of dried clay that would collapse instantly under weight heavier than 10 tons. He tested it using an old tractor. The first time, the ground held. The second time, after heavy rain, the left wheel sank almost half a meter before stopping. That was when he knew the system worked. His neighbors thought he had gone mad. They saw him digging in the cold, working until midnight under a lantern. They asked what he was building, but he only shrugged. To anyone passing by, it looked like a man plowing fields that didn't need plowing.
Even his wife Marguerite stopped asking questions. In March, the local authorities came through to collect data for crop planning. One officer from Arras inspected Émile's fields, noted the irregular plowing patterns, and accused him of wasting arable land. Émile smiled and said it was an experiment for soil drainage. The report labeled his work as non-essential agricultural activity. No one followed up. By April, he had finished the entire section. Under the surface, hundreds of narrow tunnels formed a lattice barely visible from above. After rain, the water filled the channels, making the field look lush and stable. In reality, it was a fragile shell. Any machine heavier than a few tons would cause the channels to cave in and the ground to collapse from within. When the Germans invaded in May, Émile didn't flee like most. He had nowhere to go. His wife and daughter left for relatives near Amiens, but he stayed behind with his land. He told them the same thing every farmer said when abandoning his home. "If I leave, I lose everything." But Émile had another reason. He wanted to see if his experiment would survive the rain, the shells, and maybe even the war itself. He spent those days listening to the rumble of artillery echoing from the east. The sound grew louder each morning. By early June, he could see smoke rising from the direction of Cambrai. He knew the Germans were close. That night, he wrote one last note in his journal. "The ground is ready. If they come this way, the land will decide." When dawn came, the sky was gray, the air thick with moisture, and the soil beneath his boots soft. Exactly the conditions he had built for. By the first week of June 1940, the front no longer existed. German forces were moving freely across northern France. The 7th Panzer Division, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, had earned a new nickname from both friend and foe, the Ghost Division. It advanced so fast that even German high command often lost track of its position. On June 5th, after heavy fighting near Arras, Rommel received orders to push west toward Cambrai and secure the road network for the final drive to the coast. The route passed through dozens of small villages and farmlands abandoned by their residents. Aerial reconnaissance showed no organized defense. The only potential obstacle was terrain. Rain had soaked the ground for 3 days straight, but reports from engineering officers described the soil as sufficiently stable for armored passage. At 06:45 on June 6th, Rommel's column began its approach to the Laurent farm. The division's lead unit consisted of 15 Panzer III tanks, supported by half-tracks and supply trucks. Visibility was limited by fog. The morning air hung heavy with moisture. The road ended abruptly, replaced by open farmland that stretched toward a tree line less than 2 kilometers away. The tanks moved forward in a staggered formation, standard procedure for crossing uncharted terrain. Émile Laurent watched from a distance, standing behind the remains of a stone wall near his house. He had stayed up all night listening to the sounds of engines echoing closer. Now, as the ground began to tremble, he saw them. Dark silhouettes emerging from the mist, metal tracks slicing through his wheat. At 07:30, the 1st Panzer reached the edge of his largest field. The crew believed they were driving over an ordinary farm road. They were not. The lead tank advanced 50 meters before the soil beneath it began to shift. At 07:32, the front tread broke through the surface. The entire vehicle lurched forward, its nose plunging into the earth. A second tank tried to pull alongside to assist. The ground under it collapsed as well. Within seconds, both machines were immobilized. The following units, unable to see through the fog, kept moving. A 3rd Panzer slammed into the rear of the 2nd, twisting its track assembly. The 4th attempted to steer right and slid into a ditch created by the first collapse. By 07:40, 6 tanks were disabled, their engines roaring as crews struggled to reverse. From a distance, German observers reported severe soil instability. One officer ordered engineers forward, suspecting drainage failure or hidden explosives. But there were no mines, no shell craters, no signs of combat. The field looked untouched, except for the armor half buried in mud. When sappers inspected the area, they found something they couldn't explain. The surface layer appeared firm, but beneath it, the ground was hollow, riddled with collapsed channels and pockets of air. Each cavity had given way under the exact weight of a Panzer tread. The engineers concluded that subterranean erosion caused by poor agricultural practice was to blame. They marked the field as unsafe for vehicle traffic and ordered the column to detour 5 kilometers south. The detour cost the division nearly 5 hours. Fuel trucks were delayed, forcing several tanks to halt later that day. Rommel himself noted the slowdown in his diary, writing simply, "Terrain near Cambrai, unexpected obstacle." Émile never saw the official report. He only saw what remained. Deep ruts filled with water, twisted metal, and the broken tracks of machines that had tried to cross the land he had shaped by hand. His field had done what no artillery battery or minefield had managed to do that morning. It had stopped the Blitzkrieg, if only for a few hours.
When the first reports reached divisional headquarters, staff officers refused to believe them. The 7th Panzer Division had crossed rivers, forests, and minefields without serious delay. A few soft fields could not have stopped 6 tanks. Yet radio messages from the forward units confirmed the same phrase again and again: ground collapsed, vehicles disabled. At 8:00 a.m., an engineering detachment was dispatched to investigate. The men arrived to find the scene half submerged in fog and smoke from stalled engines. Tanks that should have been advancing toward Arras sat buried up to their turrets. Crewmen stood waist-deep in mud, struggling to attach tow cables that snapped as soon as tension was applied. The engineers measured the ground density. Surface hardness was normal, around 1.2 kilograms per centimeter squared. But just 30 centimeters below, resistance dropped to almost zero. Each cavity was roughly 1 meter wide, spaced in a pattern that repeated every few meters. No explosive residue, no wiring, no signs of sabotage. It looked deliberate, but no one could explain by whom. At 900 hours, Captain Kurt Fischer filed the first technical note. Possible artificial drainage network collapsed under pressure. Recommend full bypass. Rommel accepted the assessment without further inquiry. His focus remained on maintaining momentum. The division rerouted south through open terrain, losing nearly 5 hours. For a force that measured progress in minutes, the delay was significant. German after-action reports later described the event under a single entry. Sector C-12, unfavorable ground conditions, 6 AFV immobilized, no enemy contact. In the logistical tables, those 6 tanks were written off as mechanical failures. No mention was made of the unusual soil structure or the systematic pattern of collapse. For the engineers, the mystery was closed. For the crews who had been there, it became a story told quietly in the evenings, a warning about the field that swallowed steel. Weeks later, when the division reached the Channel coast, an officer from the Army Construction Office requested soil samples from the Cambrai area. His internal memo, discovered after the war, noted, "Possible evidence of subsurface human modification. Purpose unknown." The document was never followed up. To the Germans, the incident was an anomaly, a curious but irrelevant footnote in a campaign of overwhelming success. They never learned the name of the man whose land had stopped them. For them, it was simply bad terrain. For Émile Laurent, it was proof that his land had fought back. He kept no trophies, no weapons, only the notebook filled with measurements and sketches. The field dried out over the following weeks. The cavities collapsed entirely, erasing most visible traces. By the time occupation forces took control of the region, nothing remained except a few twisted tank tracks, half buried in clay.
After the fall of France, the Cambrai region came under German occupation. The Laurent farm was requisitioned by local authorities working under the Wehrmacht's agricultural command. Émile was forced to remain as a laborer on his own land, officially responsible for maintaining crop output. His wife and daughter returned months later, under strict curfew. They found the field scarred and uneven, dotted with rusted tank fragments the Germans had been unable to recover. No one mentioned what had happened there. The occupiers considered it an accident, a terrain failure caused by poor French maintenance. Émile never corrected them. He understood that silence was safer. Throughout the occupation, he continued working as ordered, planting, harvesting, repairing machinery. But at night, he wrote in his notebook, documenting every detail of the June morning when his land had stopped the German advance. He recorded the depths of the channels, the type of soil mixture, the pressure readings, even the weather data from the local mill's barometer. To him, it was not a story of defiance. It was a record of how nature, when shaped carefully, could do what weapons could not. By 1944, as Allied bombers crossed the sky and German patrols grew nervous, Émile buried the notebook beneath a stone marker in his yard. He told no one where. When France was liberated later that year, Cambrai was once again a battlefield. American and British troops passed through, unaware that the quiet farmland had once delayed Rommel's division. To them, it was just another rural sector cleared on the way north. In 1946, French reconstruction teams surveyed the area. One geologist examining post-war soil erosion found strange patterns beneath the Laurent property, channels that no one could explain. Local residents recalled the old farmer who had played with the earth before the invasion. The geologist's report was filed under unusual agricultural methods and forgotten. Émile Laurent died in 1953, still living on the same land. His notebook was discovered years later by his grandson while clearing the barn. Inside were diagrams of intersecting trenches, pressure calculations, and a single note written in faded ink. The land remembers. Historians reviewing wartime engineering archives in the 1980s found cross-references to the Cambrai incident, the same Sector C-12 anomaly mentioned in German after-action reports. The documents matched Émile's sketches almost exactly. His design resembled early concepts of anti-tank engineering developed decades later by NATO forces, where soil density and moisture were manipulated to trap vehicles without explosives. No monuments mark the spot. The field is now part of a modern farm, planted with wheat each spring. Only aerial surveys show faint irregularities beneath the surface, the remnants of hollow structures long since filled with silt. For most, it remains an anonymous piece of land in northern France. But for those who study the details of that June morning, it stands as one of the smallest yet most remarkable acts of resistance ever recorded, a reminder that not every weapon is made of steel.
In 1968, nearly 30 years after the war, northern France underwent a large-scale agricultural modernization program. Engineers surveying the Cambrai region for new irrigation systems discovered irregular soil formations beneath several older farms. One of those properties was the former Laurent estate. Ground-penetrating measurements showed a pattern of subsoil channels that didn't match any modern drainage design. Each channel was about half a meter deep and intersected at precise right angles. The engineers initially assumed they were remnants of an early French irrigation experiment from the 1930s. One technician, a former army officer, noticed something unusual. The pattern resembled layouts used in post-war NATO terrain denial research, where controlled subsurface collapses were tested to immobilize enemy vehicles. When compared to a 1940 German engineering report archived in Berlin, the coordinates matched the same Sector C-12 incident listed by Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. In 1972, French military historians revisiting the Battle of France included the Cambrai field anomaly in a technical appendix on environmental factors affecting German armor. It was labeled simply, "Unexplained terrain collapse, probable human modification." At the time, few paid attention. There were no photographs, no surviving witnesses, and no clear evidence linking the incident to deliberate action. That changed in 1981. During restoration work on an old farmhouse near Cambrai, workers unearthed a metal box buried beneath a foundation stone. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle. The name on the first page read Émile Laurent. The notebook contained precise diagrams of trench intersections, soil mixtures, and pressure calculations. Several pages described how water distribution could be controlled by altering the ratio of gravel to clay. In the margins were short notes written in pencil. Collapse under weight, 10 tons. Field holds until saturated. Rain is necessary. At the end of the book, one entry stood out, dated June 5, 1940, the night before the German column arrived. "They are close. The ground is ready." The discovery prompted a brief investigation by the French Ministry of Defense. Analysts compared Émile's sketches to later Cold War research on anti-vehicle terrain engineering conducted in Germany and the United States. The resemblance was striking. Although Émile had never intended it as a weapon, his system operated on the same physical principles used decades later in controlled soil failure experiments. In 1983, an internal memorandum within the French Army's Engineering Corps referred to Émile Laurent's work as a primitive yet functional example of passive terrain resistance. The case was never publicized beyond academic circles, but among military historians, it became a quiet legend. The story of the farmer who had unknowingly designed one of the earliest natural anti-tank defenses in modern warfare. Today, the field still exists. Satellite imagery taken in the early 2000s shows faint linear shadows beneath the surface, aligned exactly with the original German maps from 1940. To most, they are invisible, but to those who know where to look, the pattern remains, the signature of a man who turned soil into strategy.
The story of Émile Laurent never appeared in wartime propaganda or post-war records. It was too small, too isolated, and too difficult to verify. But when viewed through the lens of modern military engineering, it represents a unique case, a single act of practical genius born not from laboratories or doctrine, but from instinct and experience. Laurent's system operated on a simple physical truth. Every surface has a breaking point, and every machine, no matter how advanced, depends on the stability of the ground beneath it. What modern engineers would later define as controlled soil failure, Émile had discovered through trial and observation. By turning his irrigation network into a pressure-sensitive trap, he achieved the same effect as an anti-tank minefield without a single explosive. In the years following World War II, military research in both NATO and Warsaw Pact explored similar principles. Studies on terrain denial and mobility control focused on how moisture, density, and subsoil layering affected vehicle movement. Several reports from the 1960s reference early civilian precedents, though none name Laurent directly. Still, his work fits those parameters perfectly, a self-taught solution decades ahead of its time. Historians who reviewed the Cambrai anomaly argued that the event, though small in tactical value, had significant symbolic weight. For hours, a single man's field halted one of the fastest armored divisions in history.
In a campaign defined by speed and mechanized superiority, that brief pause was an act of resistance without intent, the land itself pushing back against the machine. Laurent's case also challenges a central idea of 20th century warfare, that progress and victory always come from industrial strength and organized science. Instead, it suggests that innovation can arise anywhere, even from a farmer's understanding of soil and rain. When researchers reconstructed Émile's design in 1985 using modern materials, they confirmed its efficiency. Under controlled testing, the recreated grid collapsed at precisely the same load threshold he had recorded, 10 tons per square meter. The results were published quietly in an engineering journal under the title Subsurface Response to Concentrated Load on Moist Clay. Few readers noticed the small footnote. Based on an original design attributed to a French agricultural experiment, 1939. Today, the Laurent field remains unmarked, but its coordinates are preserved in French military archives. Occasionally, cadets from the École de Génie visit the site as part of terrain study exercises. The briefing they receive is short, a reminder that even in total war, knowledge and creativity can emerge from the most unlikely places. No medals were ever awarded. No reports mentioned Émile's name. Yet his work endures in the quiet logic of every engineer who studies how the ground reacts under pressure. In a war remembered for its weapons, he built something different, a defense made not of steel, but of understanding.